primary purpose of government is to protect property. The early American colonists had much to say about property and property rights because it was a critical issue leading to the Revolutionary War. The effort of the Crown to take their property through various kinds of taxation without their consent, either individually or through their representatives, was denounced as a violation of the English Constitution and English common law. They often quoted John Locke, who had said, quote, "The supreme power cannot take from any man any part of his property without his consent. For the preservation of property being the end of government, and that for which men enter into society, it necessarily supposes and requires that the people should have property, without which they must be supposed to lose that property by entering into society, which was the end for which they entered into it." End of quote. Property rights essential to liberty. John Adams saw private property as the most important single foundation stone undergirding human liberty and human happiness. He said, quote, "The moment the idea is admitted into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, and that there is not a force of law and public justice to protect it, anarchy and tyranny commence. Property must be secured or liberty cannot exist." End of quote. Should government take from the haves and give to the have-nots? As we have pointed out earlier, one of the worst sins of government, according to the founders, was the exercise of its coercive taxing powers to take property from one group and give it to another. In our own day, when the government has imposed a multi-hundred-billion-dollar budget on the American people, with about one-half being transfer payments from the tax-paying public to the wards of the government, the following words of James Madison may sound strange. Quote, "Government is instituted to protect property of every sort. This being the end of government, that alone is not a just government, nor is property secure under it, where the property which a man has in his personal safety and personal liberty is violated by arbitrary seizures of one class of citizens for the service of the rest." End of quote. Redistribution of the wealth unconstitutional. In earlier years, the American courts held that the expropriating of property to transfer to other citizens was unlawful, being completely outside the constitutional power delegated to the government. It was not until 1936, in the Butler case, that the Supreme Court began arbitrarily distorting the meaning of the General Welfare Clause to permit the distribution of federal bounties as a demonstration of concern for the poor and the needy. Before that time, this practice was prohibited. The Supreme Court had declared, quote, "No man would become a member of a community in which he could not enjoy the fruits of his honest labor and industry. The preservation of property, then, is a primary object of the social compact. The legislature, therefore, had no authority to make an act divesting one citizen of his freehold and vesting it in another, without a just compensation. It is inconsistent with the principles of reason, justice, and moral rectitude. It is incompatible with the comfort, peace, and happiness of mankind. It is contrary to the principles of social alliance in every free government. And lastly, it is contrary to the letter and spirit of the Constitution." End of quote. Property rights, the foundation of all civilizations. One of the world's foremost economists, Dr. Ludwig von Mises, pointed out that the preservation of private property has tremendous social implications as well as legal ramifications. He wrote, quote, "If history could prove and teach us anything, it would be the private ownership of the means of production as a necessary requisite of civilization and material well-being. All civilizations have up to now been based on private property. Only nations committed to the principle of private property have risen above penury and produced science, art, and literature. There is no experience to show that any other social system could provide mankind with any of the achievements of civilization." End of quote. Caring for the poor without violating property rights. But, of course, the nagging question still remains. If it corrupts a society for the government to take care of the poor by violating the principle of property rights, who will take care of the poor? The answer of those who built America seems to be anybody but the federal government. Americans have never tolerated the suffering and starvation which have plagued the rest of the world, but until the present generation, help was given almost exclusively by the private sector or on the community or state level. President Grover Cleveland vetoed legislation in his day designed to spend federal taxes for private welfare problems. He wrote, quote, "I can find no warrant for such an appropriation in the Constitution, and I do not believe that the power and duty of the general government ought to be extended to the relief of individual suffering, which is in no manner properly related to the public service or benefit. A prevalent tendency to disregard the limited mission of this power and duty should, I think, be steadfastly resisted, to the end that the lesson should be constantly enforced, that, though the people support the government should not support the people. The friendliness and charity of our countrymen can always be relied upon to relieve their fellow citizens in misfortune. This has been repeatedly and quite lately demonstrated. Federal aid in such cases encourages the expectation of paternal care on the part of the government and weakens the sturdiness of our national character, while it prevents the indulgence among our people of that kindly sentiment and conduct which strengthens the bonds of a common brotherhood." End of quote.